Hi guys, welcome back to another lesson in this series. My name is Divya and I'm here to help you all with your lessons in biology for 11th standard NCERT syllabus. So far we have been discussing chapter 1, the living world. If you go back to the previous video, you will see that we had talked about characteristics of living organisms, defining characteristics and non-defining characteristics. And in this video, we will go deeper into section 1.2, diversity in living organisms. So in this video, we will be discussing the following topics: biodiversity, nomenclature, classification, taxa, and taxonomy. But before we get started, I'd like to do some active reading like we did in the previous video, where we will skim through the chapter and look at all the headings and the subheadings and see what terms are highlighted and get an idea about what this topic is going to be about. Okay, so let's get started with that. Okay, so now we have here section 1.2, diversity in the living world. And as I am skimming through this topic, I see there's some words that have been highlighted: biodiversity, nomenclature, identification. They sound like things to do with scientific naming or classification, I guess. We'll see what they could be about. Something about binomial nomenclature, that does ring a bell. Okay, ICZN and ICBN, okay, something to do with codes for nomenclature, okay. And here I see a list of rules for naming, okay, something to do with biological naming of organisms probably. And there is mention of another word, taxa. I wonder what that is about. We'll find out soon. And something about taxonomy. Okay, I guess it's referring to taxa. And here another word that is in bold is systematics. And there are some Latin terms. Okay, we'll find out soon. Okay, so what do you guys think this topic could be about? To me, it seems like there's lots of Latin and something to do with naming and scientific names. There's also mention of some scientists and something to do with categories. You guys can come up with your own questions and assumptions, and we'll understand this topic better in the following slides. Okay, so our first topic here is biodiversity. And the definition for biodiversity is basically the number and types of organisms that are present on Earth. So it could be a collection of various species that are present in a specific area. And something to note here is, as you increase this boundary or as you increase this area, the number and range of species you'll find within that area also increases. And I did a quick Google search to see how many species there are currently on Earth, and it seems like there are about 8.7 million species that have been discovered so far. And this is a number that will be quite different from what is mentioned in your NCERT textbook, and this is mainly because it hasn't been updated, and also this whole process of discovering new species and accounting for them is an ongoing process. So this number is only going to keep increasing as time progresses. Okay, so now moving on to our next topic, which is nomenclature. Nomenclature is basically the process of naming things. And I want you guys all to look at this image here. Basically, this is the image of a tomato, and surrounding it are the names of tomato in different languages. So as you can see, this is one organism and there are so many names for what it can be called in different languages. And this can cause a lot of confusion, which is why there is a need for standardizing this process of naming a particular organism such that it is known by the same name all over the world. And that's why there is a need for nomenclature. Okay, and for those of you who are curious about what the scientific name for a tomato is, If you guys can pronounce it, it's Solanum lycopersicum. Okay, so now we'll get into a little bit more details about nomenclature. So basically, to help with this process of naming living organisms, there are two books, you could say, or two codes for this processes. One is International Code for Biological Nomenclature, and there's International Code for Zoological Nomenclature. Basically, ICBN helps with naming of different species of plants, and ICZN takes care of the naming process for different animal species. And these two codes make sure that each organism has only one name and no two organisms have the same name. I hope that was clear. Okay, so now I want to introduce you all to this term called binomial nomenclature. And this is a process of naming of living things that was proposed by this scientist called Carolus Linnaeus. And we'll talk about him more in the coming slides. But basically what he proposed was the system of naming living things such that every name has two components. So one will have, the first component is called the generic name, and the second component is called the specific epithet. And because it has two components or two parts to it, it's called as the binomial nomenclature. And I just want to add a clarification. If you guys are confused about the difference between the specific epithet and the species, basically, the specific epithet is the part of the scientific name that denotes the species. And species is exactly that. It is referring to what species does the organism belong to. So to clarify this further, we belong to the species of sapiens. So we are all Homo sapiens, and the part of this scientific name Homo sapiens, the sapiens part is the specific epithet. And what species do we belong to? The answer is sapiens. So I hope that was clear. I know it can be a little confusing and sometimes it is used interchangeably. So I wanted to clarify that. Okay, now we'll move on to universal rules for nomenclature. So it's important to note that this is not a blind process. There is a specific structure that is set in place for naming of living things. So rule number 1 is biological names are mostly in Latin. They are either Latinized or they are derived from Latin. So as you can see, Mangifera indica is a Latin name. Along those lines, number 2. So the first word denotes the genus and the second word denotes the species. This is something we just discussed while we were talking about why it is called binomial nomenclature. So rule number 3 is basically about what should we follow when we are writing these scientific names or when we are typing them. So if you are to handwrite scientific names, make sure that both words are underlined. And if you are printing these words, then both words have to be italicized. And number 4 is similar to how these names are written and printed. Basically, we want to make sure that the first word starts with a capital letter and the second word starts with a small letter. And here you can see that is what is being followed. Okay, and something else that is important to note is that sometimes the name of the author, that is the person who has discovered this organism, he is given some attribution, he is given some credit. So basically his name is abbreviated and added to is appended to the specific epithet. So basically if you have Mangifera indica, you can see that Lin is mentioned here. And Lin comes from the last name of Carolus Linnaeus, so it's the abbreviated form of Linnaeus. This doesn't happen all the time, but you will see it in some cases. So that was about nomenclature. I hope everything was clear. and we'll move on to the concept of classification. So what is classification in general terms? It's basically you have this spread of random objects and you group them together into some sort of categories, or you'll put some labels on them, basically based on some common characteristics. For example, you have like this image of plants and animals in this box, and if I had to classify them, I'll classify this as, okay, here I have all the plants and the trees, and here I have all of the animals. So basically I've chosen some characteristics and I've put them into two different boxes, and this is the process of classification. And what these are, basically the labels or the categories, is taxa. So the scientific name for the categories is called as taxa. And derived from this, taxonomy is the process of classification. So this exercise of grouping living things based on some common characteristic and assigning these categories is called taxonomy. Basically, in simpler terms, it is the process of classification. And it's important to note that everything we have been discussing so far, that is identifying organisms, nomenclature, classifying them, looking into their different characteristics, so all of these processes kind of form the background for how you would go about with this process of taxonomy. So you need to know how to characterize them, how would you identify them, what grouping categories are you using, and how do you name them, what rules are you following. So it forms like the foundation for our process of taxonomy. And just to note, this is not a process that we got started with recently. It is being done for a long time now. So since the olden days, people have been grouping living objects. I guess now we do it more for scientific knowledge, and you want to discover new scientific processes. But initially we got started with it mainly to see what use a living organism could be for humans. So that was the background for how this process was originated. How do these organisms serve us, and what buckets can we put them into, was the main motivation. Okay, now we will talk a little more about Carolus Linnaeus. He is kind of the father of nomenclature, you could say. He proposed binomial nomenclature. And he also wrote a book called Systema Naturae. I hope I'm saying that correctly. Basically, this book was about systematic arrangement of all things, all living things that you find in nature. And he was studying what are the relationships between these different things, how one organism is linked to another. Okay guys, so that is the end of section 2. We have studied biodiversity, nomenclature, classification, taxa and taxonomy. So in the next video, we will be delving deeper into taxonomical categories, which is a bit of a dense but also a very important topic. So I will see you all in the next lesson. But before you go, if you want to connect with me on Instagram, my handle is @moleculesandme. And please give this video a like and subscribe to this channel so you can see more video lessons like this. And also comment below if you have any questions or feedback. Thank you.